Markets do not always reveal stress where the stress begins. Sometimes the first signs appear in one part of the system, are handled quietly, and seem to stay there. Trading continues. Screens still update. Transactions still clear. Institutions still operate through the same desks, the same funding channels, and the same market routines. From the outside, the structure looks intact, but liquidity stress does not always stay where it starts. One market can absorb pressure quietly, and that response can change the conditions under which another market has to operate. No public warning is needed, no formal rule has to change. The first market adjusts internally, and that adjustment becomes part of the environment facing the next market. That is the pattern here. This is not a story about visible breakdown. It is a story about pressure moving through institutional behavior while the system continues to look functional. Liquidity. Stress is often imagined as a dramatic event. Buyers disappear, funding stops, prices drop sharply. But institutions usually encounter it earlier, in quieter ways. Balance sheet space becomes harder to use. Certain collateral becomes less attractive. Financing becomes less convenient. Execution becomes more selective. Positions that once felt easy to carry begin requiring more caution and more conservative assumptions. The market is still operating. It is no longer operating with the same ease. That matters because major institutions do not participate in one market at a time. The same dealers, treasury teams, clearing channels, collateral frameworks, and risk controls connect activity across many markets at once. If one area becomes harder to handle, that change rarely stays isolated. The same capital is being managed across multiple exposures. The same collateral is being evaluated for multiple uses. The same balance sheet is supporting more than one market. So the real question is not only whether one market is under stress, the real question is what institutions have to change in order to keep that market functioning and what those changes do to the next market connected to it. A market under liquidity pressure does not usually announce that it has become fragile. It adapts. Dealers quote more carefully. Inventories are carried with less comfort. Collateral that was acceptable yesterday becomes less desirable in practice. Funding is still available, but not on the same assumptions. Participation remains, but not with the same depth. Capacity is still present, but it has become conditional. Once capacity becomes conditional in one market, the institutions connected to it begin working with a different internal map. Treasury teams preserve more flexibility. Risk teams apply tighter discipline to balance sheet usage. Trading desks become more selective about what they can warehouse, what they can finance, and how long they want to hold it. The institution is still active, but it now operates under a tighter operating logic. That tighter logic does not remain inside the first market. Imagine a market where financing positions become less balance sheet efficient, or where certain collateral must be treated more cautiously. The institution responding to that pressure has clear choices to make. It can preserve liquidity for higher priority uses. It can shorten holding periods. It can reduce tolerance elsewhere. It can prefer assets that are easier to finance, easier to sell, or easier to pledge. These are internal reallocations. Each one changes the conditions facing another market. A simple example occurs when tighter funding conditions in bond markets make institutions more protective of balance sheet space. That pressure does not stay inside bond trading. It can reduce how freely balance sheet is used in adjacent financing activity, alter collateral preferences, and make liquidity elsewhere feel thinner even without a formal disruption. The second market may not show obvious signs of stress. Instead, the change may appear as narrower participation, less willingness to intermediate, greater selectivity in what gets financed, and a stronger preference for one kind of collateral over another. There is less tolerance for positions that require time, balance sheet patience, or uncertain exits. Again, the second market is still functioning, but it now operates under assumptions shaped partly by pressure that began somewhere else. That is when liquidity stress stops being local. Not because one market suddenly collapses into another, but because institutions begin carrying constraints across linked parts of the system. The linkage does not need to be obvious to the public. It only needs to be real inside institutional handling. A desk preserving funding flexibility in one market may become less willing to extend balance sheet capacity in another. A tighter collateral preference in one area can change how easily another market is supported. A reduction in warehousing tolerance for one set of exposures can alter market-making behavior somewhere else. A precaution taken in one environment becomes a condition felt in the next. At that point, the system is no longer just processing isolated pressure points. It is processing interaction. This is why liquidity stress often appears uneven. Someone looking directly at the first market may conclude that the issue is limited because trading continues. Someone looking at the second market may see only small behavioral changes, less depth, more selectivity, slightly different pricing, slightly different participation. None of those changes alone looks decisive. Together, they reveal something more important. The system is adapting across connected spaces. And when that happens, institutional behavior becomes more informative than headlines or isolated price moves. The first market may still look stable because institutions have found ways to absorb the original pressure. The second market may still look normal because the effects arrive as subtle changes in operating tolerance rather than obvious dysfunction. But the pattern is no longer simple containment, it is transmission through procedure. Markets are not linked only by sentiment or narrative. They are linked by the institutions that finance, intermediate, clear, collateralize, and manage risk across them. When those institutions adapt under pressure, they change internal priorities, and those priorities travel. A dealer does not preserve balance sheet flexibility in one market while behaving as though nothing changed everywhere else. A treasury team protecting liquidity in one funding environment does not leave every adjacent activity untouched, and this is about how institutions reprioritize. A risk posture tightened in one area does not remain perfectly sealed from the rest of the institution because risk moves through processes and practices. The adaptation itself becomes mobile. That is the important shift. Liquidity stress becomes structurally important before any single market has to visibly fail. It becomes important when institutions begin translating one market's constraints into another market's operating conditions. And because this happens through internal handling rather than public declaration, it can continue for some time without producing one dramatic signal. Internal choices matter long before headlines do. Markets still open, transactions still occur, prices still print, rules still appear unchanged. But more of the system is now operating around preserved flexibility, selective deployment, and conditional capacity. The language of stability remains. The procedures of adaptation expand underneath it. This is also why a system can look calm while becoming harder to navigate. No one needs to announce that liquidity has become more fragile across markets. It is enough that institutions become more selective about where balance sheet space is used, what collateral is preferred, how much intermediation is offered, and how much uncertainty can be tolerated. Those are not public statements, they are internal handling decisions. But internal handling decisions are exactly how market structure changes before public language does. Once multiple markets are adjusting around each other, the question is no longer where the original strain started. The question becomes how far institutional caution has begun to travel. Because once caution travels, the system stops behaving like isolated arenas. It becomes a connected operating environment in which each market's flexibility partly depends on what institutions are already preserving, protecting, or limiting somewhere else. That is what makes cross-market liquidity stress structurally important, not spectacle, not panic, not a headline event. A shift in how institutions carry pressure through the system while preserving continuity on the surface. And that is the deeper pattern to watch. Liquidity stress matters differently once one market's adjustments start shaping another market's assumptions. At that point, the issue is no longer a local loss of ease. It is a system learning to operate with mobile constraint. The structure still stands, but the freedom inside it is no longer distributed the same way. And when that happens, the most important changes are often not the ones that begin where the pressure first appeared. They are the ones that emerge where that pressure quietly arrives next.